Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, got a new Dungeons & Dragons video. See, with Halloween getting close, I decided it'd be time to do something a little spooky. So today, we're going to visit Castle Ravenloft, or Castle Strahd. I guess it's Castle Strahd, realistically, because I'm actually going to be talking about a little bit about the history of Ravenloft, where it came from, and everything else in relation to Dungeons & Dragons, as well as its own standalone setting. So bear with me, folks, and hopefully you learned a little bit about the history of actually one of the more famous, if you will, settings for Dungeons and Dragons. So let's get on with it. It was originally a supplement for AD&D, starting way back. And with that being said, it's actually been carried over through several editions. Pretty much it's actually been a part of every edition of Dungeons and Dragons since its inception. And it's also had a series of books, video games, and even board games. And it has, over the years, become one of the most popular micro settings within Dungeons and Dragons. And it's also inspired other media as well, such as Castlevania. Now, with that being said, it is, like I said a bit ago, originally it was a micro setting. Now, what a micro setting is within Dungeons and Dragons, it's a demi-plane, and essentially the reason it's a micro setting is because it's contained within actually a small area. Ravenloft is not a fully fleshed out world. It's not like Dragonlance. It's not like Forgotten Realms. It's essentially its own world within its own setting. And essentially, when you look at the planes, the Ravenloft setting is actually one of its own planes within the regular Dungeons and Dragons setting, if you will. Actually, it's even one of the many planes within my Dungeons and Dragons realm as well. And the inception of Ravenloft dates actually back to 1978 with Traci and Laura Hickman. They were the original creators of Ravenloft. And I would highly suspect that the setting, the tone, and everything else was inspired actually by the older horror movies, particularly the Bela Lugosi Dracula, which is actually why that little clip playing at the beginning of the video. That's if YouTube actually clears that. But moving on. Now, with that being said, it would later be released in 1987 by TSR. That's the official release by TSR. Traci and Laura Hickman actually spent a few years playtesting it, and it was actually a setting that they did every Halloween to kind of play test it out and everything else, and it makes great sense. It's a horror setting. Now, for those who don't really know, TSR was actually the original company that had Dungeons & Dragons. At least when it became a company, Dungeons & Dragons, the original part really wasn't initially published by TSR. But with that being said, TSR would go on to release several supplements for Dragonlance over its years throughout first edition, second edition, and then later things would change pretty drastically for Ravenloft, and that is because of Wizards of the Coast getting essentially snatching up, buying up TSR and getting the rights to Dungeons and Dragons. And a part of those rights was also the rights for Ravenloft. And that's actually where things would change. So at first, or initially, it would seem like Wizards of the Coast did not actually have any interest in doing Ravenloft as a micro setting, or at least at the time. Instead, they would license it out to White Wolf Publishing, and they would actually publish it. They would start publishing Ravenloft in 2001 under the Swords and Sorcery title. And essentially, that was their license for Dungeons and Dragons, if you will, from Wizards of the Coast to publish Dungeons and Dragons products. And essentially, they would take Ravenloft and they would convert it into a whole setting. But now, with that being said, literally just a few years later, basically from 2001 to 2005, White Wolf Publishing had the licensing for Ravenloft. However, the licensing would get turned back to Wizards of the Coast, and they would do in 2006. They would release the Expedition to Castle Ravenloft. That's towards the tail end of the life of 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons. It was also the first book to signify the end of 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons. You could kind of feel at that point, if you were paying close attention to what was going on at Wizards of the Coast, what was going on with Dungeons and Dragons, that the winds were shifting, things were changing, and basically fourth edition was going to be coming out sometime soon. And actually, when fourth edition came out, Ravenloft quickly came to fourth edition. It actually came first as novels, and then they released a board game, and then they released a module all in 2008 for Ravenloft. Now, with that being said, I've heard criticisms about the various looks of Strahd over the years. A lot of people are not real fans of Strahd from Expedition to Castle Ravenloft. But honestly, I feel this is the worst looking version of Strahd. But either ways, we will move on. In 2016, Ravenloft would return again, and I feel actually this is one of the best looking versions of Strahd when it comes to the art, besides the original from the AD&D days. This is from 2016. Ravenloft would return again for 5th edition as the Curse of Strahd Adventure Module. So basically, when White Wolf Publishing had it, it was its own standalone setting with its own player books, its own Dungeon Master's Guide, its own monster manual, so on and so forth. And then when it returned to Wizards of the Coast, it became a supplement again, starting with the Expedition to Castle Ravenloft. And even in 5th edition, the Curse of Strahd would stay as a supplement for Dungeons and Dragons. And the nice thing is, because of how the supplement is written, you could use it to supplement any setting. So if you want to do, if your primary setting's Dragonlance, you can use Ravenloft. If it's a generic D&D setting that you created, you can use Ravenloft. If you're doing Forgotten Realms, you can use Ravenloft. Even Greyhawk, you could use Ravenloft. So it's actually pretty cool how Ravenloft has been done over the years. Now, with that being said, the setting itself would stay in Barova, which is the map you see here. I believe actually this might be from the Curse of Strahd expansion. I don't actually have Curse of Strahd. I actually have Expedition to Castle Ravenloft. So I'm not 100% sure where this map came from, but this map is not in Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, although it does have a slightly different one. Now, with that being said, what is going to be the future of Ravenloft now that there's a new edition? There's a new, I guess it's called 5.5 edition is the newest edition that's actually in print now. The Player's Handbook had just recently come out at the time that I'm recording this video. Well, I really don't know what the future of Ravenloft is going to behold with 5.5 Dungeons & Dragons. But with that being said, 2016 was quite a few years ago at this point, and now they're cranking out a new edition. We're talking the Curse of Strahd is over 8 years old, and now they're cranking out a 5.5 edition. So I would highly suspect that there will be a new edition of Ravenloft sometime soon. And that's essentially just because, since Ravenloft was introduced into Dungeons & Dragons, it's been kind of married to Dungeons & Dragons. It's a mainstay part. Just like Forgotten Realms has been a major setting within Dungeons & Dragons since it was introduced, essentially Ravenloft, the setting of Ravenloft, has actually been a major part of Dungeons and Dragons as well, even though, interestingly enough, it is actually not a completely standalone setting like Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms. But anyway, folks, I think I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed learning a little bit about the history of Ravenloft and its marriage, if you will, to Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Have yourself a wonderful day and a happy Halloween.